So it's a great pleasure to be a keynote speaker in the very first conference of this type. And I'm going to be brave and present something that is based on recent work, but also is new and speculative. and I'm going to do that by going back to one important theme of the recent work in philosophy of psychology, which is in what circumstances we see a belief as pathological, and whether we can identify some clear boundaries between beliefs that are pathological or are considered to be pathological and other types of beliefs that we consider violating norms of rationality. So the question is really whether conspiracy beliefs, as many people have suggested, are a bit like delusion, whether there is a genuine overlap between beliefs in conspiracy theories, hereafter conspiracy beliefs, and delusional beliefs. So I guess there are two research questions underlying the talk. The first is whether we can identify overlapping features between delusional beliefs and conspiracy beliefs, and a lot of really interesting work has been done in philosophy, in psychology, social science, and psychiatry on this topic. There are several dimensions here to consider. We may be thinking about how the belief is formed. We may be thinking about how people express the belief or how they act in relation to the belief. And we may be thinking about consequences that the belief has for the person who has the belief or for their community. And I think all of these dimensions, probably there are even more, but all of these dimensions are important. But for a question of time, I'm just going to concentrate for this talk on the cognitive antecedents of conspiracy beliefs and delusion. So whether there is anything in the way we reason that makes it more likely for us to endorse delusional beliefs or conspiracy beliefs. And my answer to that question will be, well, yes. But then there is another question, which I think is much more difficult to answer, because in a way, the first question, it's a matter of interpretation of the empirical evidence available to us. But the second question is a philosophical question in the traditional sense, because it requires us to make decisions about how we use the concepts that are available to us. So does the presence of whatever features are overlapping between delusions and conspiracy beliefs justify our attempt at pathologizing those beliefs? And when I talk about pathologizing beliefs, I talk about the idea that if we think that one person is having a belief like that, we also tend to assume that they are either out of their mind, or they don't really know what they're saying, or they're not really worth engaging in common epistemic projects, and we'll talk more about that. So that's kind of the general assumption, and it's definitely one of the reasons why the word delusion is so stigmatizing. It's because it is associated to these features that are not merely neutral and descriptive, but they tell us something about how we judge the person who is attributed those beliefs. And my answer to that question, whether the overlapping features justify pathologizing conspiracy beliefs and delusions, is no. And the spoiler is these overlapping features are actually things that we're all extremely familiar with and characterize cognition more widely, not just the type of cognition that gives rise to the endorsement of those beliefs. So I will start by talking about stances, which is very 1980 of me, but kind of betrays my age, and the idea that maybe there is something about the intentional stance that we can unpack and can be useful in understanding what it is that we're doing when we pathologize beliefs. And then I will be talking about what is involved in belief attribution and when it is that we decide not to engage anymore with a speaker. And finally, I'll just review very briefly the empirical evidence suggesting that there is overlap in the cognitive antecedents of delusional beliefs and conspiracy beliefs, with the caveat, of course, that, when we talk about delusional beliefs, there's an enormous variety and heterogeneity of different type of mental states. And similar with conspiracy beliefs, conspiracy theories can vary in almost any way. But, just thinking, I will use a little video to just focus on some specific characteristics of the way in which we behave when we endorse delusions and conspiracy beliefs. Okay, so just starting, what our stances are basically ways that make it very explicit what kind of assumptions we use when we want to explain a system's behavior or predict what the system will do next. And I follow here Dennett in talking about systems, because we may be talking about a colleague, a friend, we may be talking about a pet, we may be talking about the dishwasher or an artificial intelligence system. It doesn't really matter. So when we are thinking about how we can predict a system's behavior, we focus on what the system does and make kind of attributions to that system accordingly. So in the physical stance, we tend to think that the behavior is mostly to be explained by reference to the physical properties of the system. In a design stance, we think that maybe there is some kind of design that might explain how the system reacts to certain stimuli. And in intentional stance, we tend to attribute intentional states, so beliefs, desires, and things like that, to the system, and to assume that the system has some kind of general background of rationality. So that's all very familiar to us. One thing that is interesting to notice, and I didn't think about until quite recently, is that all stances, to some extent, are a bit objectifying. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying it like it's something that we shouldn't be doing. We need to be able to do it. But the intentional stance, just like the physical and the design stance, is most useful to us in the way in which we conceive it when we want to coordinate with another system, for instance, joint action of some sort, or when we want to manipulate the behavior of the other system. So very often, if we want to make a specific prediction, what is the next chess move that the person will make in a game, or, whether they will arrive late or early at the cinema, we don't actually need to kind of consider a lot of different aspects of what makes that particular system an intentional agent. We just need to be able to have enough information that will give us a reasonable shot at predicting what they will do. And so we may not be interested in what those particular systems need or want in other circumstances, or how those particular systems make sense of the world around them. And that's exactly what the stance is for. It's for predicting. But it may be that, especially when it comes to those kind of systems that we consider intentional agents, that we use the intentional stance with, sometimes we want to do things with them that are a little bit more interesting and complicated. So we may want to engage in common epistemic projects that require us to be able to see them as having a perspective on the world that we might not share, but that we consider valuable. We may be interested in the variety of interests and needs that they might have, not just specific to a task, but more widely. And also, we may want to consider the agentic bit of their behavior as intentional systems. So the fact that, even if they cannot determine what happens to them all the time, they have the capacity to contribute to change and intervene in the environment around them. And they have the capacity to participate in decision making. So those are not things that, we have never thought about. They are part of what we think agency is, I would argue, but very often are not necessarily involved in very simple applications of the intentional stance. And then because we may have different purposes from just explaining and predicting. So I will use the word collaborating to mean pursuing common epistemic goals, which is a bit of a choice just to make it easier for me to present. But sometimes we have interests of that kind. And they may be triggered by different things. Maybe we think that the agent has knowledge and skills that are required for achieving the goal and that we don't have. So we need to kind of exchange and share skills and resources. Or we may be in the business of making a decision that requires their participation. So that decision needs to reflect not just our needs and values, but also theirs. So here I'm thinking in particular, to make it a little bit more concrete, about shared decision making in a lot of different contexts. For instance, when we see a doctor and at the end of the interaction, we may need to have a treatment plan, for instance, that requires a lot of involvement, or a committee who needs to make a collective decision about how to respond to a crisis or anything like that. So we may be thinking that this aspect of the intentional stance, which is not really an independent stance, because, every system that we can interpret with the intentional stance is also an agential system, an agent. But we may be thinking maybe the agential stance is something like an intentional stance plus, because we focus on those things that I mentioned. So not only we assume that, at least for the purposes of our interactions with them, these agents have kind of beliefs, desires, and act on those, but we also assume that they have a unique perspective on the world that we consider valuable, that we are interested in. They have intrinsic complexity, and they have these superagential qualities, so they can intervene in the world and they can participate in the process of making decisions. Now, what is interesting is that sometimes we interpret people's behavior using the intentional stance, but depending on future aspects of their behavior, we decide to withdraw the agential stance. So we stop considering their perspective as valuable, and we stop thinking that they have the capacity to, for instance, participate in shared decision making. So let me give you a very silly example. So at the University of Birmingham, nowadays, lecturers have to get to their classroom and they have to give students a code. It is a string of numbers. And basically, it's an attendance code. So every student has got this app, and they open it and they digit the code, and that means that they were present at the lecture, right? So it's a kind of a system that we've got now. And that gave me the idea about this example. I'm just saying this because it may be that it's not a shared practice. So suppose that I go into my classroom and I digit a code, like I write a string of numbers on the board, and I say, okay, this is your attendance code. Fine, the students think, okay, this is my attendance code. This is a good, conscientious lecturer who cares about my attendance score, and now I'm going to input it, and we can get on with the lecture. But suppose one day I go in, and I write this string of numbers on the board, and then I say, okay, pay attention, guys. This is the meaning of the universe. The KGB told me last night, and I've decided to let you know so you can prepare for what's to come. Now, it may be that at the beginning, the students look at me weird, maybe she's trying to be funny. After all, she talks about delusions all the time. Maybe, it's a practical joke or something. So there is kind of this suspension. They don't really know what to do with me. But then they notice that I'm completely serious. I'm not trying to teach them anything. I'm just communicating what I think is right. Now, what happens to the students? They probably won't stop, attributing to me beliefs and desires. They will probably, attribute to me the belief that that string of numbers is the meaning of the universe. They will probably attribute to me the desire that, I want them to know because I think it's an important piece of information. So the intentional stance may still be working to some extent, but their conception of me changes. Because clearly the type of belief that I've expressed and that I seem to be convinced about is a delusional belief. So they may be coming up with explanations. They might even undermine the intentional stance to begin with. They may think I'm intoxicated, or I have some mental health issue and I forgot my medication. You know, there could be explanations for my behavior that they kind of diverge from the kind of explanations that we use within the intentional stance. Sorry, I got too ahead. Bear with me. Okay, so what are the consequences of this interaction? One of the consequences of this interaction with the students is that if they attribute any beliefs to me at all, they attribute to me delusional beliefs. And a consequence of this, a further consequence of this, is that this, in fact, will prevent them from engaging with me in what I've been describing as genuine collaboration. So they will not attempt to pursue common epistemic goals with me anymore. Why? Well, because if I do have a perspective on the world, it's not a valuable perspective. It differs too much from the shared reality that they experience. And if I do have concerns, they're not valid concerns, and so on. I'm not the kind of person who they will invite to participate in shared decision making. And coincidentally, I'm currently running a workshop for the Voice Collective, which is a group of very young people who hear voices. And we are talking about their experiences with healthcare professionals. And everything they say absolutely confirms this to a heartbreaking degree. So they often say the moment that the word psychosis or delusion is on my medical notes, people stop believing that I have capacity for anything. So if I'm in the room with my parents, they talk about me to my parents, the conversation completely bypasses me. And it's just a very vivid example of how this works. So the presence of a delusion, the attribution of a delusion immediately takes away a bit of our agency from how people see us. So when an interpreter recognizes a system's belief as delusional, in the brilliant work by Sam Wilkinson, the attribution is not a neutral description of the system's beliefs. It's not like a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as a delusion, for a belief to count as a delusion, but is instead an expression of disapproval, of folk epistemic disapproval, right? So the moment that I'm thinking you are delusional, what I'm doing is judging your behavior and from an epistemic point of view, finding it wanting, lacking. So by doing this attribution, the interpreter implies that the intentional system, if it's still an intentional system, big question mark there, is not in the right mind, they don't know what they're saying, and so on. So the system is discredited as a source of reliable information and excluded from the pursuit of common epistemic goals. So this in a way tells us that the attribution of a belief as a delusion, and I would say also the conspiracy belief, I think that applies to conspiracy beliefs as well, reveals something very important about the interpreter's attitude towards the content of the belief. It's not just a description of what the speaker said, and affects the interpreter's future attitude towards that system. And I've got another example that is not from the clinical dimension, which I think is very interesting. And I was looking at articles in the press, and in the paper, I have lots of examples, but here I'm just going to give you one, but they're all similar. Someone describes someone else's belief as delusional, and in the next sentence, they say what they are stopping to do with them, you know, how they've decided to change their behavior towards them so as to exclude them from some kind of common epistemic project. So this is an example from Reuters. When the executive director of South Africa's Presidential Commission on Climate Change called the country's coal industry delusional, he added, "It's going to be impossible to have a conversation with the industry if we can't get past the basic denialism." So they are delusional, because denialism is often described in terms of a delusion. Therefore, we can no longer have a conversation with them. It's extremely common. You know, you may change the terminology, but it's something that you find everywhere. So why? We may ask why. Why does the attribution of a delusion or a conspiracy belief lead us to dismiss the point of view of those intentional systems and abandon what we may call the agential stance towards them? So I think one reason why we do that is this assumption that delusion and conspiracy beliefs are pathological beliefs. Maybe the presence of a delusion, of a conspiracy belief, is actually a signal that something else is wrong with a person. So it's basically an indication that there is something malfunctioning in their belief formation processes, and therefore they are no longer to be trusted. Okay, so that's the preamble. And then we want to see whether there are things in common to delusion and conspiracy beliefs that are not necessarily present in other cases of belief formation, and they might kind of justify this assumption that as beliefs they are pathological.
How do conspiracy theories?
Sorry, I'm going to start by showing you a video. This is only 90 seconds. Yeah.
How do conspiracy theories take hold?
Our supply of seeds is gone. It's a disaster. This trail of seeds leads to Beetle. He must have taken our seeds.
Don't jump to conclusions. How can you be so sure that it was Beetle? We haven't gathered enough clues yet. Spider, what do you think? Grasshopper's theory makes sense. Yesterday, Beetle was ogling your seeds. He must have decided to steal them in the night. Today, your seeds are gone, and now he's fast asleep. Grasshopper's theory makes sense. I give you that, Spider. Looking at all these leaves off the branches and the nests fallen on the ground. Isn't it more likely that the strong wind last night scattered our seeds around? Grasshopper, you are stuck. When you can't stand the uncertainty, you may be tempted by an intriguing story. A story that is simple and coherent and points to someone else as the villain. When we do not know how a new virus emerged, we may speculate that evil scientists created it in their lab. But we should wait and gather more evidence, because once we commit to a theory, it is difficult to give it up.
Okay, so this was the video. And there is a problem, right? In the garden, the seeds are missing. We are supposed to believe this is a serious problem because this was the supply of seeds that ant and grasshopper had for the winter. If they lose their seeds, then they will be starving in the winter. So grasshopper is evidently distressed. He looks around, he sees a trail of seeds leading to Beetle, who is sleeping peacefully in the grass. And Grasshopper becomes certain the Beetle stole the seeds and tell his friend Ant about his theory. So it's quite important in the story that Grasshopper seeks clues, seeks evidence. He's not just coming up with this theory without looking around, but the conspiracy theory, if it is a conspiracy at all, this is more just like an explanation of what is happening, is something that he arrives at after considering the evidence available to him. And then there is Ant. Ant we may describe as more cautious than Grasshopper, and notices how there are seeds scattered around, but also observes other things being not in the right place, the leaves and the broken branches all over the garden. She is a bit concerned about Grasshopper's intention to blame Beetle for what happened. She doesn't seem to think that Grasshopper has enough evidence against Beetle. And also considering the other clues that she finds, suggests that a strong wind must have scattered the seeds in the night, made the leaves fall from the trees, and caused some branches to snap. And here you can see that although Grasshopper's explanation makes the significant event be the effect of the deliberate action of someone, possibly with evil intentions, Anne's explanation is more towards looking at natural causes that might have determined the scattering of the seeds. Now, what interests me in this story is whether there is anything specifically wrong with Grasshopper. So is it just the case that, as it happens, Grasshopper comes up with an explanation that we may think is less plausible than Anne's explanation? Actually, intuitions here diverge. When I show these videos to children, they tend to agree with Grasshopper, that it was Beetle. But, I mean, is it just that? Or is there anything else? I mean, are there ways in which we can evaluate, possibly negatively, what Grasshopper does and identify a pattern that explains why sometimes we are attracted to delusional explanations or conspiracy beliefs? Also, if it does have belief-forming processes that are imperfect or malfunctioning, does that fact disqualify Grasshopper from genuine collaboration in the way we defined it? So should we stop pursuing common epistemic goals with Grasshopper? So there are a number of things that Grasshopper is meant to illustrate. The first one is the famous jumping to conclusion bias. So one thing that you might have noticed about Grasshopper is that it does not wait to gather further evidence. Once he identifies the trail of seeds, he comes up with this theory about Beetle being involved. So we could say that he jumps to conclusion. And we jump to conclusions when we make a decision or opt for an explanation of an event without waiting to have sufficient evidence to support that decision or that explanation. Now, there are, of course, different and somehow conflicting operationalizations of the jumping to conclusion bias. So this is not, by all means, the whole story. But for the purposes of today and the time that we've got left, what we can say is that something akin to the jumping to conclusion bias has been associated with delusions for many, many years. It's been one of the very first kind of biases associated with the formation of delusional beliefs, especially in paranoia. And indeed, it's very frequent in research papers on the cognitive antecedents of conspiracy beliefs for the researchers to start out by highlighting the overlap between paranoia and conspiratorial thinking. And one of the parallels are exactly this idea that people who are attracted to delusional explanations and conspiracy beliefs also tend to have a stronger jumping to conclusion bias. So, for instance, in non-clinical samples, so people without a psychiatric diagnosis, what was found is that people who displayed that jumping to conclusion bias presented a more pronounced belief in conspiracy theory. So if they believed conspiracy theories, their belief in the conspiracy was stronger. So also one thing that has been observed in the non-clinical population is that people who gather less information before making a decision seems to be more committed to the conspiracy theory. So in the context of COVID-19 conspiracy theories in Germany, it was found that higher levels of conspiracy belief endorsement were associated with greater tendency to jump to conclusions and greater paranoid ideation. So again, here conspiracy and conspiracy theorizing and paranoia go together. Let me just proceed. So Sanchez and Dunning, they talk about the jump into conclusion bias in a more popular piece. They define it as going with our gut. And they talk about it definitely as something that is not a dysfunction, but is something that we are all vulnerable to, especially in situations where there are incentives to decide or act promptly. So it's possible that people with certain personality traits or thinking styles have a more pronounced tendency to jump to conclusion, but the jump into conclusion bias is something that is very widespread in the non-clinical population. And Sanchez and Dunning argue it is something that we can try and work on if we can increase our tolerance to uncertainty. So it's the fact that we cope very badly with uncertainty that leads us to this particular thinking style. Another thing that you might have noticed about Grasshopper's explanation is that he points to beetle as the villain, as the person, not the person, but the insect or whatever, responsible for the disappearance of the seeds. And again, this is a very common tendency. We all have a tendency to attribute responsibility for something significant that happens, especially when it is something with negative consequences, to someone who deliberately did something wrong. Now, there are a number of biases, a family of biases that explain different aspects of this phenomenon. Of course, the one that comes to mind is intentionality bias, which is associated with symptoms of schizophrenia, also schizophrenia-like symptoms in the general population. And Moore and Pope argue that persecutory delusions held by some patients may be explicable in terms of exaggerated intentionality bias, where these patients are more prone to seeing events that happen to them as intentionally caused. So this is just about whether something is intentionally caused or not. It's not really about blame or agency yet. But there is another aspect of what Grasshopper is doing, which is captured by something called hypersensitive agency detection. So we do tend to attribute sometimes intentionality and agency to things that shouldn't have intentionality and agency, sometimes inanimate objects, and to explain certain events as caused by deliberate action as opposed as being caused by natural mechanisms or natural causes. So this is also something that has been associated with the endorsement of conspiracy beliefs. So in a study where accentuated intentionality bias is detected in schizophrenia, the continuity with non-clinical populations is something that the authors underline very strongly. It is important to consider, they say, differences in schizophrenia in the context of the normal biases shown in subclinical populations, rather than thinking of these biases as present in populations with schizophrenia and absent from normative populations. So it's not that people with schizophrenia have the bias and the rest of the population doesn't. It's more that we all have it. But given that the presence of this bias and its actual use depends also depends on environmental factors, then people who have certain conditions and are more likely to be stressed, for instance, or be in situations that are considered to be adverse, are more likely to rely on those biases. Bach says problems may arise for those with schizophrenia because they show an amplified bias for intentionality or because they have trouble controlling this bias. So it may be that they take it too far, but the fact that they have the bias is not itself a sign that something is different from the general population. So again, you know, the bias is characterized as something that represents a continuum between conditions that are considered to be pathological and ordinary thinking. Sorry, for some reason, it's going all over the place today. let me just do this. So we've done the jumping to conclusion bias and hypersensitive agency detection. The last one that we consider is the join the dots bias. So one thing that Grasshopper does, and it's very evident in the spider's contribution to the story, when the spider presents the web of events and how they are linked to one another, Grasshopper infers causal links between a number of facts that is able to observe. So the seeds are gone, there is a trail of seeds leading to Beetle, and Beetle is sleeping. So it's like, he's not looking for food or anything, but he looks like he has a full tummy and he is having a good nap. So here, clearly, Grasshopper is inferring causal links between, let's say, Beetle sleeping and the fact that the seeds are gone, which may not actually be a reliable causal links. It might just be a mere correlation. And that is what Ant is driving at when she proposes an alternative explanation for the disappearance of the seeds. Now, we have a number of causal illusions, and something like the causality bias, which is something that Elena Matute studies, for instance, occurs when people believe that there is a causal relationship between events that are actually independent of each other. And again, very often this is described as joining the dots. Identify causal relationships is something quite difficult because we don't, of course, directly observe causality, but we need to infer the relationship based on a number of different factors, including, the temporal succession of events. So it is actually quite a difficult thing to infer causal links in a reliable way. And it's not surprising that in that context errors are made, and Matute and their team study this kind of causality biases in the medical context as well. So causality biases happen to be more prominent in delusional thinking and conspiratorial thinking, but there is, again, a very clear continuity in the way people join the dots across clinical and non-clinical context. And one proposal, for instance, is that something like a delusional belief emerges when people connect events that no actual connection, and sometimes this may be due either to the causal illusions that we all are subject to, or kind of overestimation of their own control over a number of situations. So one feature of conspiratorial thinking, says Van der Waal, is the rejection of the idea that a significant event could be due to a coincidence, right? So maybe it's just a coincidence that Beetle is sleeping and the seeds are gone, accompanied by the suggestion that there is a causal connection instead, even when such connection seems vague and implausible. And I think this makes sense of a lot of examples of conspiracy theories that we might have in mind, where there is a significant event to explain. That's something that we can all perceive. But then there is also something else that is happening that to most people doesn't seem to have any particular relation with the event, but in the conspiracy, the two things are made to depend on each other. So the tendency to draw implausible causal connections between events is a crucial driver of conspiracy thinking. So perceived causal connections are considered as an important factor in the adoption of conspiracy beliefs, especially in the study of science denialism, and also is considered to be quite important in the capacity or lack of capacity to distinguish real news from fake news. Seeing connections where there are none contributes to the denial of scientific explanations. It makes it harder for people to recognize misinformation because there is a abundance of causal connections. So just to the conclusions now, we've just scratched the surface. Of course, I've just focused on 3 ways of thinking about evidence when we're looking for an explanation. There are lots more parallels between conspiracy beliefs and delusional beliefs that we haven't looked at, but definitely it seems as if there are several cognitive antecedents in common between conspiracy beliefs and delusional beliefs. A jump into conclusion and need for closure, so finding an explanation fast, an explanation that doesn't generate more doubts or delays in the way in which we want to interact with the world. Intentionality and hypersensitive agency detection, when we tend to think that significant events are effects of deliberate action and often action by ill-intentioned agents. And causality biases, where we tend to see events that may be merely correlated as having a causal connection between them. So there are two final thoughts I want to share with you. The presence of these biases it doesn't seem to be a good reason to consider conspiracy beliefs and delusional beliefs as pathological. Of course, there may be other arguments why they're pathological that we haven't considered, but just based on the cognitive antecedents that we discussed today, it doesn't look as if there is enough of a gap between normal cognition and pathological cognition in this particular context. And definitely there doesn't seem to be anything but continuity between how we reason in everyday context and how we reason when we are attracted to delusions or conspiracy beliefs. So in the words of Moreno Fernandez and colleagues, the cognitive biases are not restricted to pathological states, and they often appear in other individuals, is reinforced by research showing that even experts can fall prey of biases routinely. So they're actually very widespread biases, and very often dependent on environmental cues as opposed to ways of thinking or character traits. The other thing, which I think is probably more controversial or more counterintuitive in some way, is that in the way we have been looking at them, delusions and conspiracy beliefs are not reasons to deny agency to people. They are actually expressions of agency. So delusions and conspiracy beliefs emerge precisely in those situations where we are asked to exercise epistemic agency. When we're faced with something unexpected, maybe with an unusual experience or a distressing event, and we seek an explanation for that event. So there is nothing more epistemic than that. And that's exactly where we act as agents. We search for an explanation. Grasshopper, just like ant, is going around looking for clues. We need to make a decision, sometimes in conditions of stress and having not very much time to wait for the expert's take on things, and we attempt to solve a problem. So I think it's very implausible to think that they are nothing but expressions of our agency. So if that's right, what can we do to overcome the assumptions, stigmatizing assumptions towards people who have delusional and conspiracy beliefs? I think we should recognize that some of the biases and thinking styles that are at least partially responsible for our conspiracy beliefs and delusion can hinder our epistemic goals in some context. They might lead us to the wrong explanation. They might lead us to blame a beetle when beetle has done nothing wrong. But in those biases, those same tendencies may be what saves us, or maybe what we need in a different context, in a different cognitive task. And indeed, Grasshopper may be our guy when it pays to be vigilant, like in a community where we have reason to think that people are going to act against us and resources are limited, being Grasshopper may be exactly what we should be doing. So there are no obvious cognitive antecedents of delusions and conspiracy beliefs. There are not also antecedents of beliefs, full stop. So that's the message I want to give. So it's true there is overlap, but it's overlap with lots of other things too. So our lay conception of conspiratorial and delusional thinking as agency defined is untenable if the key features of the belief-forming processes leading up to delusions and conspiracy beliefs are continuous with key features of non-pathological human cognition and agency. And the QR code is if you want to see more videos on conspiracy. Thank you very much for listening.